Well, hello and welcome to the Kingfisher Podcast with Eric and Bron Whitley. We're back again this week with a topic that I think is just really, really important. It's one, might sound a little bit negative, but it's actually something that I think it's really important for us to discuss and for people to be aware of, and that's the topic of rejection. And we're kind of taking an angle today a little bit on particularly prophetic people and when they're operating in that gift, feeling rejection, and how do you deal with that? Because if you are a prophetic person, at some point, rejection is going to be an issue that you face.
Yeah, and we welcome back again this week the amazing and wonderful Joanna Bickerton.
Hi.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Such a joy.
Did you bring any of the cupcakes that you were talking about last time?
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe next time.
You often do bring us cake, though.
I do.
So,
I like to.
You know, the kids, when you come to their house, the kids are like, where's the cake?
It's just good marketing to take it with me everywhere I go.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So Joanna is a cake decorator and artist, and she also runs the prophetic ministry at our local church.
That's right.
Yeah. And so we have you with us because we thought you'd have some fantastic insights on this, because I know we were even talking earlier. I know you've experienced rejection as a prophetic person.
Oh, yeah.
I've probably experienced that as well. Bronwyn, I think you've probably felt some rejection at times.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's not just about being a prophetic person, but I think as a Christian, if you attend church for a long period of time, at some point you're going to experience offense and rejection and hurt within a church setting. It's just a given because there's humans in church.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, somebody said the other day, and I've heard it before, if you find a perfect church, don't join it because you'll ruin it.
It's true.
And,
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
It's true. I mean, you know, we laugh about it, but it is a serious issue. A lot of people leave churches and leave church in general behind because at some point they've been hurt or rejected by someone or more than one in church. Rejection, I think, is a serious topic that we don't talk about enough, I think, because I know that there are a lot of people out there who have stopped attending church. And once you stop attending church, it's only a matter of time until your faith sort of diminishes and drifts away. The Bible tells us to not give up gathering together, and there's a reason for that. It's because we encourage each other and we strengthen each other's faith when we're together. And when we don't spend those times in fellowship, it can really impact the faith that we have. And as a prophetic person, that's even doubly so, because when we come together and we share testimony with each other and encourage one another, it really is so valuable towards helping us operate in that gifting.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things about rejection is there's kind of two types of rejection. There's a real rejection where somebody says, no, we don't want you here doing that thing anymore, go away. Or there's kind of perceived rejection where you feel like people are shutting you out or not taking up whatever it is that you're offering.
Not valuing it.
Exactly.
Yeah, not seeing the value in it.
And especially I think when people are highly prophetic, they might know the call that God has placed on their life and they just don't understand why everyone else doesn't see it as well.
That's really true. I think one of the hard things, I was thinking about this when we were recording one of our other podcasts, was that when you have a prophetic nature and when you've really spent a lot of time honing your gift, you do have a fairly clear understanding of how God would like things to be. And when you share that with people and other people don't get on board with that, it can feel like they're rejecting you. They're not actually, they just haven't seen it the way God has shown it to you, but it can feel very much like they're not interested in you or what you have to say.
Well, you know, as a musician, so I'm a trained musician, studied music at university, played in bands and toured, done studio work, all this kind of stuff. And there's a lot of talk around musicians. You know, you wouldn't ask a painter to come to your house and go, well, how's $20 to spend the next 3 Saturdays painting my house? Yeah. But with musicians, it's like, can you come to my wedding and I'll just only give you $20, you know, to play for the next 6 hours. Yeah. You know, and they don't take into account and value, well, I've spent countless hours honing my craft. I mean, when I start to look at
rehearsing,
I was going to say, when I look at the amount of money I've invested into being a musician, instruments, university fees.
I'm aware.
You are aware.
The office is mostly guitars and guitar equipment. I squeeze my desk in there.
Yes. You know, you really invest in yourself, and then people don't value what you give. But, like a wedding without good music is not as nice. It's not
well, everyone loves music.
Yeah.
It's a really important part of the world that we live in, but where you're going is that it's not necessarily always valued.
No.
And so musicians and other artists often feel a lot of rejection, especially because the art that you do, and you would understand this, Joanna, the art that you do, it feels like a piece of yourself at times. And so people who work in the creative arts can often feel rejected because if someone rejects their art, whether it's music or a book or a piece of art or a cake, or doesn't like what you've done, or doesn't feel it's worth paying for, or whatever the case may be, then it can feel like a rejection of you as a person.
Very personal.
Well, it is very personal because I think you put your heart into whatever it is that you've created for someone.
And I think it's very similar in church. When someone is called to a ministry or anointed for a ministry, they maybe think that they're supposed to be a worship leader, or they are acting as a worship leader, or they might think that they are called to be an elder, or whatever the position that they really feel strongly about or are operating in. If they are then pushed out of that position, or they aren't accepted into that in the church in general, it also can feel like a real rejection of who they are as a person.
Yeah.
Well, I think, and particularly in the prophetic, when we share a word, I mean, I've had those moments, and I laugh at them. Like, I don't consider them deep rejections, but, you share a word. Does that mean anything to you? Not a thing. I've had those before. I don't relate to that at all. I don't know what you were thinking.
It can be very disappointing.
So, I mean, that's a simple thing, but it could still, for some folks, that could feel very hurtful that they just kind of went, and just sort of swiped it aside. But I think there's other times where someone really feels called. Maybe they feel like God really has called them as a prophet and that they're to function in this role, but yet nobody else has recognized it. Of course, one of two things. Either they maybe aren't a prophet, or it is something that they just haven't realized what God's called them to just yet. Like, like the calling's going to come to fruition. It just hasn't happened yet. And sometimes it's hard to be in that waiting before we step into the fullness of God's calling on our lives.
Yeah.
So, Joanna, what do you think someone should do if they're in that situation?
Well, I think rejection within the prophetic comes in many forms, actually. I think you can perceive that the word you've brought has been rejected and then feel like it's personal and that you've failed somehow, or you're being rejected with you and your gift are being rejected. It also can be like what you were saying just now, Eric, about sensing a calling on your life and having other people reject that calling. Or, I had an interesting experience. I had a drawing for somebody one time, and I gave the drawing to this person, and they looked at it and their face was blank, and I was like, does that mean anything to you? And they were like, They kind of didn't say yes or no. They kind of just grunted at me, and they didn't look pleased at all.
Were they a teenager by chance?
No, it was a person
we hear
who
a lot of grunting.
We do.
Classically, I can imagine, who you would classically expect to be quite expressive. And so I was confused. And they kind of took the picture and went away, and I was so tempted to be hurt and to feel rejected and downcast. And I think that raises an interesting point in when you think about your prophetic gift. The win is, I heard God clearly. I knew what I was supposed to do with it. I did it in love. That's the end. We have no obligation beyond that moment. That person is not beholden to us as to whether or not they engage with the prophecy, whether it impacts them deep, high, whatever. That's actually not our business. Our business is that we were faithful and we did it. And then we really should kind of dust our hands and walk away, not in a callous way, but in I've done my job. The rest is Holy Spirit's job. And so if we kind of hold on to it for too long and we leave our hand on it as the person walks away with our gift, we can create room for them to have to reject us because we're trying to hold on to something for too long, and they have to push our hand off it so they can keep going on with their life. So there's that element where we've actually done something that's created a need for somebody to step back from us.
Well, I think it sort of speaks into, and we talk about this in some of our training for the prophetic community, is your gift is not your identity.
Exactly.
And so if you give someone a gift and they reject it, or like you got underwear for Christmas, and it's not your favorite thing, it doesn't actually reflect upon you.
That's right.
Your, as we were talking about before, value, your worth, who you are, any of that. It's just, okay, they're not connecting with this, or maybe we did miss it, whatever it may be.
Yep.
Yeah.
But your gift is not your identity. It's something you just function in.
Yeah.
And I think if we forget that, it's very easy to feel rejected.
Yeah. And that's a great segue to the other version that I've experienced, where having led in this space and served in my church in this space for a really long time, I was invited to be involved in some stuff at another space where they were doing some prophetic training, and I went along to that, and it was incredible. And then about a year later, they were running some more of that, and I kind of just connected with them and said, hey, that was such a blessing to me last time. Is there room for me to be involved there again? Which is a big risk for someone who doesn't like confrontation. And the message that came back was basically, from our point of view, you don't align with the biblical prophet as the Bible describes them, and we don't actually think it's appropriate for you to be coming along to this training because you don't fit the criteria.
Wow.
Yeah. And I read
There's criteria now.
Well, I think I do understand.
I think there is to some degree, maybe not officially written out in stone, but yeah.
It was a strange way to put it. And I guess I understand as someone who does lead a prophetic ministry, there have to be, guardrails and boundaries around what we do. And so I understand where they were coming from in that regard. But knowing what I know in terms of my life and what the Lord has said to me and how I'm operating in my own church, having that person say that really was a bit of a gut punch. But I had the choice in that moment to go, oh, I'm being rejected, now I'm offended, and build a little home for the enemy to set up camp and really ruin some stuff. Or I could go, my go-to phrase is always, Jesus, what do you say about this? And he just said to me, it looks like rejection, but I'm actually protecting you. And I was like, oh,
that's great.
Yeah, I'm like, great, fine. Don't want to be a part of it. Thanks.
And I think you make a really good point, because that's kind of what I've learned, and I've learned it the hard way, is that in any time where we have our feelings hurt, we're offended, we've been rejected, someone has turned us away or severed a friendship or whatever they've done, we have a choice in that moment whether we set up camp in that rejection and offense and bitterness and let it ruin our lives, or we can choose to let it go, forgive and move on. I have an example where, operating in the prophetic, we now are in a place where we've been doing this for a while, and we've set up some boundaries around how we do it. But when I first started out, I gave a word at church, and it was a really simple word, but I had sought God and prayed, and I felt like this is what God was saying. But I tacked something onto the end of it, and so the word was, people will know who I am, God, who God is, by how we love one another. And then I tacked onto the end of it, and I don't think we do that very well. Now, the word that God had given me was the first part, and then I tacked the other part onto the end of it. And there was a person who was running that meeting who then publicly rebuked me in front of the entire group and turned away and basically shut me down. Now, that person was a good friend of mine, and that really hurt my feelings as a prophetic person who has sought after God for a word. And I learned a lot in that moment. I did get my feelings really hurt in that moment. But looking back now, I have moved on, forgiven, and come to terms with what happened, because a few months later, an international speaker gave a word over our church, and he said, the world will know who you are as a church by how you love one another. I mean, we'll know who God is by how you love one another. It was the exact same word that God had given me, and the same people that I gave it to were fawning over the international speaker and the word that he gave. And so that was something that I really learned a lesson. Don't tack things onto the end.
True.
Think about what it is you're saying. Yes, maybe you see that we're not doing this well or something, but think about how you're presenting the word. And that's something that we really focus on in culture. The culture of our prophetic ministry is our words should encourage and uplift and edify. And we have to be really careful the lens that we're filtering things through. Am I saying this from my own place of hurt, or the way that I view the world, or what my experience has been, or is this actually what God has said?
Yeah, and I think the fact that the people were offended enough to actually outrightly reject you in that moment and reject what you had said in that moment doesn't mean that what you had said was wrong, because what you had said was right, but just not all of it was helpful. And so I think, when God gives us this revelation, and I think we might have touched on it in one of the last podcasts, was that everything that you saw in the Lord in that moment was accurate, but there was only a part of it that he actually wanted you to say out loud. And I think for me, the longer I keep talking when I'm prophesying, the less holy it gets.
That's a good
God
point.
help me to shut my mouth when I've said what you want me to say
Exactly.
and not add too much Joe to it.
Yeah. That's a good point.
What I want to sort of focus on is, like you said, okay, I felt rejected from that experience, but I worked through that and I forgave and tried to, move past this, and you probably had to release judgment, as I recall.
I did. Yeah, I did. It was a process that I had to go through, because I think, especially when you're younger and you're not used to rejection as much, any little rejection can feel like the end of the world. And especially if it's a friend and it's at church, when you've got all these worlds colliding and
unexpected.
And church feels like family when you're a part of it, and our church certainly does. And so when you feel shamed and rejected and offended, or any of those combination of those things, it can really be hurtful, and you can choose to just wallow in that pain and bitterness and pull away and set up the little walls, camps,
and really build it. Hey,
well, one of the big things
yourself.
I've seen people do is go around and try and gain support from their side. So
that's true.
They go to every single person except for the person who's hurt them and offended them. And what I think it's human nature to want to be justified and to
listen to what this person did, and aren't you on my side?
That's right, and affirmed, and it becomes actually really bad,
toxic.
And toxic. That's a great word. I was looking for that word, toxic, because not only are you offended, now you're bringing others along, and now you've started to gang up on a certain individual, which is undeserved, and
you're
all that.
Investing in unity.
When we talk about rejection, I don't want to just leave it as that. I want to talk about how do we in a godly way, how do we respond to it? Because feelings we can't control. Feelings come in. Okay, so we can't control that emotion as it happens. We can control then how we respond to it, as you were saying. Do we wallow in it? Do we take it to others? Do we lay it at God's feet? And I've found that with rejection, even though it's deeply hurtful, it's something, I love that Jesus goes, there's nothing that you've been through that I can't understand that I haven't been through, because he was rejected.
Oh my goodness.
And so when we start to take these things, whatever emotion you feel, if it's anger, if it's hurt, if it's pain, whatever, he's familiar with it all. And we can lay it at his feet. And because he's experienced it all, he has authority over it all, which means he can heal it. He can bring reconciliation. He can bring comfort. He can bring what we need in those moments.
So for me, it was really just taking it to him in prayer. And I had to choose to humble myself. So, there's a lot of pride when you get offended and rejected.
Absolutely.
I had to choose to humble myself. I had to choose to forgive. I had to choose to put it behind me and reach out in love moving forward, no matter what. And these are not things that I've just learned lightly. No. This is over many years of having to deal with these things, because, a lot of us are quite sensitive. And
especially if you're prophetic.
Yeah. And I was raised in an environment where we didn't sort of move past rejection and offense. We built walls around ourselves and we withdrew. I've watched as someone close to me has used offense and rejection to fall into deep depression for many years, to put up walls around their heart that they no longer have any respect for anyone at church, or aren't able to garner any kind of wisdom from sermons that they hear any longer. They don't want to be vulnerable in church. And it's really impacted their faith to the point where they're not even sure they have faith anymore. So you have to make a choice. You have to make a choice in that moment. Do I want to have a strong faith in Jesus? Do I want to have a relationship with God? If I do, then, and we've talked about this in a previous podcast, you have to forgive. We have to humble ourselves. We have to show love to the people around us, even if they hurt us. And, when you're in a family, which a church is like a family, there's going to be hurt. It's just
dysfunction, just
it's
as much as
guaranteed.
a natural family. Yeah.
You're guaranteed to get hurt.
Oh, that's so true. I mean, I have never met a family that's not dysfunctional in some way. Like every family has dysfunction somewhere.
Yeah.
We may hide it really well, but it's there somewhere.
Yeah.
I think because God has made us for a relationship. You know, we've spoken about this, about loving God and loving others. And of course, that's even the question from the lawyer or the other Pharisee, what's the greatest command? And that's, you know, Jesus comes back, well, how do you read it? And he says, love God and love others as you love yourself. And he goes, you've answered correctly. Relationships are hard. It doesn't matter what kind of relationship you're in, whether it's a marriage or a friendship or a working relationship. There are times that we're going to have conflict.
Absolutely.
And I think within the church, I guess rejection, as we were mentioning before, is so personal because we do see it as family and we use that language. God is our father and we're brother and sister and we use all this stuff. And so I think it even hurts more deeply when we feel rejected or we feel devalued.
It definitely does. And I think part of that is because, you know, maybe you are part of community clubs or schools or different things that you interact with people in your community. And if someone hurts you there, you can just sort of cut them off and walk away and not have anything to do with them again. But when you're a part of a church family, you can't really do that. Or it's certainly not godly to do that. We're told to love one another, and it says it over and over in the Bible. So it's obviously a really important thing. And when it says love one another, it's talking about the brethren, the Christians, brothers and sisters in Christ is probably a better way of putting it. But it's saying love one another, those of you in church. So those people who are sitting next to you, they're not necessarily going to have anything else in common with you other than a love of Jesus. And so sometimes it's hard. It's really hard to love one another really well. And that's why it says it over and over, I think.
I think one of the things that contributes really highly to rejection is the fact that for a lot of us, we're trying to gain our sense of self-worth from how other people feel about us.
That's a big one.
And so you said it before, Eric, when we talk about identity, and the more we get our sense of identity from who we are in the Lord, the less easy it is for people to offend us and for us to feel rejected. And I think for me that was a big one, especially with that moment where that person was saying, we don't believe that biblically you fall into this category. I'm so passionate about the prophetic and have built a lot of my life around it. And it really gave me pause to say, God, this is hurting me deeply. Have I made this ministry a God instead of you or above you?
Yeah, and like an idol.
Yeah. And I felt like he was saying to me, it really doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. If you get accolades or a label from man, then they can also take it away.
Yeah,
so
that's
if you
so
are
true.
getting who you are from me, no one can take that away. And so it really, God is just so kind in that in those moments we can go to a place in him where he can take most of the sting out of it. But I think part of that has been the fruit of my healing journey as well. We mentioned a couple of podcasts ago that, you know, some of my childhood wasn't super pleasant. And so I had some stuff that I was carrying with me, and, you know, we all have our baggage.
We all have
that's what makes rejection possible. But my healing journey has been this amazing kind of walk through seeing all these things that I had taken on that I was carrying with me to try to be okay, and God just gently lifting those things off me and saying, hey, you're actually okay exactly as you are, just as you are, just you, not all the things you try to do, all the things you try to say and be and look and whatever. And so experiencing that with him to a greater and greater degree through my Christian life has made it so much easier to be in moments where I experience that really devastating rejection, no matter who it is, and say, okay, well, they only know in part. God knows everything, and I'm in God. And so I'm safe in him. Who I am is safe in him. What my life is about is safe in him. So it doesn't really matter what other people say. I just need to keep my head down, humility, surrender, quick obedience to God, and he will take care of everything else.
It's interesting because I think it's fairly simple. Now, in practice, it's not so much, but it's fairly simple to deal with rejection in a godly way, as we've talked about, to forgive, to move on from that, to release our judgments and try and reestablish a healthy relationship with someone. I think, what's the word, rejection proofing ourselves might be a way to say it. And I think that's a bit of what you're talking about with identity and knowing who you are. I know a while back when I was studying identity in Christ, it was kind of that aha moment for me was recognizing if we're fully fulfilled in our value and our worth and who we are is in Jesus, then the things that I do for someone, like a lot of times we do things hoping for something in return.
Yeah,
now, not necessarily a financial thing, but we do something and we want somebody to go, oh, good job, or thank you, or whatever.
Yeah.
But if we're doing that kind of becomes your reward.
Yeah.
And Jesus, like the Pharisees were a bit that way, and he said, you've already got your reward because man's going, well, look at how righteous you are.
Yeah.
But if you're serving God, the reward's later. It comes down the track.
Yeah.
But when we know who we are in Christ and we're fulfilled, like there's a satisfaction and a fulfillment there, then the things I do for you or how I serve someone or whatever, I'm not looking for anything in return because I'm already satisfied. Like there's no lack.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
And that sort of rejection proofs you.
And I know that you do this because I can testify to that. Because as your wife, I've watched over the years, you've been in ministry nearly 30 years. And over the years, there's been so many times where you've been criticized or rejected or hurt or, those sorts of things, or people just haven't treated you the way that probably I as your wife think that they should treat you. And I know I've said to you years ago, I said, how do you keep going? How do you keep going back to work every day doing this over and over and over again? And you looked at me and you said, well, I'm not doing it for them. And that was a really great moment for me, teachable moment for me, because I tended to do things wanting to get some sort of feedback, praise, but ministry is one of those things where you very rarely ever get any kind of encouragement or praise, which is unfortunate. But we're doing it not for our own glory. We're not doing it for somebody else's praise and adoration. We're doing it for God. And that is something that we have to remember. And I think if somebody's like, for example, I've heard people say things like this, like, I feel like I'm called to be a worship leader. I'm a worshiper and that's the call on my life. But my church won't recognize it and won't let me sing up front, and they feel really rejected by that and they want to leave the church over it. But I think that when you take that on board as your identity, or God's called me as a worshiper, so that's what I am, and so that's what I have to do in my church up front, and I want everyone to recognize that and tell me how great I am, you're setting yourself up for a fall and for rejection and for discouragement. And I think instead all of us need to come into our church with a humble heart of how can I love well in this place? Not I'm going to come up here and show you how great I am and what God has gifted and called me to do. But how can I come into this place as a part of this family and love well, whatever that looks like, however, I'm accepted and chosen and whatever to be. How can I love people well? Not what can they do for me, but how can I love them well?
Well, again, saying I'm called to be a worship leader, if that's your identity, there's a problem. It's just like we were saying with the prophetic. If I see my prophetic gift as my identity, there's a problem there.
Yeah, that's right.
Because that's not who I am. It's just something that I operate through, and that's a way God uses me. Michael W. Smith, maybe if you remember contemporary Christian music from the 80s and 90s.
I do.
I'm that old. But I remember hearing him talk about this, how one of his goals, and this was in recent years, maybe 10 years ago, he was just saying, my goal in life is to be unoffendable, that no one can offend me. And I thought, well, that's a weird sort of goal. But as I sort of rationalized it out and thought about it, it's exactly what we're talking about. When you're unoffendable, the enemy has no foothold in your life. You can't get in there. And it does make you fairly rejection-proof and hurt-proof and all that, and you can just live in love.
Yeah, and when you think about it, the times where you do feel rejected and you do feel angry and upset and hurt, you're not able to love other people well in those moments because you build little walls around your heart and you act in anger and you resentment and you're not able to be vulnerable with people. But when you live from a place of, I'm not going to allow these things to offend me, I'm not going to allow these things to hurt me or to shake me and my faith, then you can continue just loving people really well and not let it bother you. And as you said, it comes from just an understanding of what your identity is. And sometimes someone might be operating in a gift in the church and that the season for that comes to an end, and they may not be listening to God. I've definitely done this. They may not be listening to God well, and he's sort of hinting it's time to move on to something else, and then you don't because you like doing it, and and it gives you validity and validation. And then when other people move you on because you didn't listen the first time, it can really hurt. And when we are operating in some sort of gift in the church and we let that become part of our identity, or we let it be how we feel validated and valued and loved rather than through God and the way that he sees us, then we can get really hurt and offended. But I think it's really important to just remember that everything God calls us to is for a season.
That's
and
true.
It's not who we are.
And I think too, it's helpful to remember that no human can reject us out of God's plan. So if God has a plan for our life, there's nobody who can wreck that. That doesn't matter what choices other people make about your value or your place. The Lord is going to have his way, and he's going to make his beautiful things for your life come to pass. And so it's just a matter of trusting him and letting him redirect you.
I think that's a really good point.
Well, I think those are some great points and some great insights, particularly about the area of rejection. It is something that if we spend much time, as I've said, in the church or around people for that matter, we're going to feel it at some point. But I think God's given us those areas, those abilities, or those opportunities. That's probably the best word, is opportunities to take offense or not. And it's all based on whether we truly know our identity in Christ. And then if we are offended, we have the opportunity to be obedient and forgive and release that person from how they hurt us. So rejection is something we're all going to experience, but it's not something that has to have deep impact in our life. Like it doesn't have to have something, it doesn't have to be something that dictates the future going forward. It's really something that we can hand off to God quite easily. And
know that he never rejects us.
Well, that's it. Yeah. We can always turn to him. Well, we're just so glad that you joined us today and had a listen, and we hope that you are encouraged. And if you've experienced rejection in your own life, my encouragement to you today is to just forgive that person, lay it down at God's feet. Where you're hurting in your heart, Jesus can fill those places. He can give you comfort, he can give you peace, he can restore. And so I just encourage you to turn towards him today and be healed of that rejection and that offense, because he's good and he's capable. This has been the Kingfisher Podcast with Eric and Bron Whitley, and we just want to thank Joanna Bickerton for being with us as well.
Thanks,
it's been
guys.
such a pleasure, and we hope to hear from you next week. You guys have a great time.